Quick question. Is the political journalism that we consume today better or worse than it was 20 years ago? Well, today on the Media Pack, we take you behind the cameras to talk to the people who create the news and ask whether you're getting the political journalism you deserve. Recognize this place? It's the foyer of the House of Commons. It's the place where politicians and the press gallery collide. But is what goes on here really as spontaneous as it looks on TV?
Mr. Speaker, let me remind this member.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians do know.
This is something I had called upon the Prime Minister.
When it comes to politics, most of us are pretty familiar with this scene. After question period, cameras and reporters swarm cabinet ministers, MPs, and opposition leaders, grinding them for a pithy quote, or, if they're lucky, to catch them with a slip of the tongue.
I'm not allowed to talk about anything else.
But when we finally read a newspaper story or see it on the evening news, how does it go from this
at the same time, we know that
to this? To find out, I met with Global TV's Peter Harris, a veteran of the Parliamentary Press Gallery. How does a journalist like you, who's covering the Hill, decide what stories to follow and who's really just trying to feed you a line?
Well, I think that decision happens all the time. That decision is happening every morning when every newsroom is having its morning meeting. I mean, this place is entirely built on spin, and 90% of the time, every time you have a conversation here, somebody's trying to take you in a direction. And if you don't understand that, you shouldn't be covering the Hill.
What is meant when we talk about spin?
Well, when a journalist asks a politician a question, it's a war. And different governments have approached that differently. The Liberals in the past approached it by leaking information, and that was their way of controlling the message, controlling what stories got out there. This government took an entirely different approach, and I would argue the Prime Minister has taken an entirely different approach, and he's battened down the hatches and not allowed us in. And has that worked? I don't think it has. It's left a vacuum where stories bubble up, and that's what journalists run with. And you have to, as a journalist, sort of say, it's, you know, I mean, let's call it for what it is. It's a bit of a BS meter. You have to say, wait a second, this isn't where the story lies. I understand that's where you want it to go, but that isn't necessarily where it goes. And that's an important part of filtering out a lot of the spin.
Well, I think it's just at the level of security that...
Spend a couple of afternoons on Parliament Hill watching what are called press scrums, and it's not hard to see that there's a dance going on here between the politicians who need the media to get their message out and the news organizations who need the politicians so they can file their stories. But who drives the agenda? That's a question I had for this veteran of Parliament Hill, the Globe and Mail's Lawrence Martin. So Lawrence, I'm curious to know, who drives the agenda on Parliament Hill? Is it the politicians or is it the press?
Well, it's obviously a combination of the two. I think some weeks the media leads it, and some weeks the politicians will lead it. But the media role is very central, because you find when you're covering question period and covering Ottawa, you see the morning headlines in the newspapers or on television, and you sort of automatically know that they will be the main discussion points or debating points in Parliament that day. The politicians take their cue from what the media decides are the big stories.
And those headlines have become all important to those who swim in Ottawa's political waters. But how are the headlines generated?
I mean, it's totally arbitrary. An editor could take some what might be considered some very piddling event, balloon it up into a big headline on the front page of the Globe and Mail, and all of a sudden that's what people are talking about. And that's what the politicians have to respond to, because the people on the streets are seeing that in their newspapers or on TV and are talking about it. So it's the media who really set the tone and often the subjects of the national discussion. So the power of the media is enormous. It can't be underestimated.
While the power of the front page headlines can't be underestimated, the parliamentary press gallery doesn't always see it that way. In fact, many journalists have become increasingly frustrated with one office that they believe is trying to stifle the flow of information to the press. Which office? This one, the Prime Minister's office, or the PMO. If, as Marshall McLuhan stated, the medium is the message, well, in Ottawa, the PMO is the message. We're always hearing about the Prime Minister's office, or the PMO as it's known here on the Hill. Why is it and how is it that this institution is so incredibly controlling?
Well, they have a lot of power, and power controls who has the spin and who can shift the agenda more easily than other people. And right now, with this government, they ignore the power that journalists have, or else try and mute it, which makes the power structure go back to the politicians. Right now, I think you have a Prime Minister's office that's extremely powerful. You have people inside the Prime Minister's office who are very powerful.
Any historians or analysts will tell you that over time, power has become centralized in Ottawa to the extent that the Prime Minister and his little coterie of unelected advisors hold, the vast majority of say in the government.
There seems to be an agreement in Ottawa that the power of the PMO has increased since Pierre Trudeau's time, and that with each passing Prime Minister, the media message seems to get more and more controlled. But shouldn't journalists be going around the Prime Minister's office? I was curious to know if journalists felt under-resourced and how it was affecting their journalism. So I met with Rob Rousseau, the top man in Ottawa with the Canadian Press. What do you think of the state of journalism, and in particular political journalism in Canada?
I think it's thriving. I think that more and more people are doing the kind of work that they might have been doing a few years ago had not the current government put a hermetical seal over a lot of the information. For a long, long time, a lot of reporters in this town depended on the government to sort of let them know what the news was of the day. Their decision to sort of put obstacles in the way of the normal flow of information is actually made for better journalism.
What you're saying is that maybe it's had some positive unintended consequences because it's driven more investigative kind of journalism?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, it depends on what your definition of journalism is. Is it what the government wants you to know? Well, sometimes, yes, it is. But I believe that the best journalism is often what the government doesn't want you to know.
So what is it the government doesn't want you to know? Well, I found out there's a game being played in Ottawa's press gallery. What is that game? That's up next.